Tired out from his journey, Jesus sat down by a well in the land of Samaria while his disciples went off into the city to buy foodstuffs. A woman from the city came out to draw water, and Jesus asked her for a drink of water. Well, she was surprised and said, "Why are you, a Jew, asking me for water?" And because the Jews didn't have any dealings with the Samaritans. And Jesus responded and said, "If you knew who it was who was asking you for a drink, you would ask him for a drink, and he would give you living water." Well, intrigued, the woman said, "Well, you don't have a bucket. Where are you going to get this living water?" And Jesus went on to explain that the water he would give would bubble up inside of one to give them everlasting life. Well, the woman carried on the conversation and said, "You people say that in Jerusalem and on that Mount Zion is where people ought to worship." But Jesus expressed something to her that even his disciples had not really come to appreciate. He said, "The hour is coming, and it is now, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth." Previously, Jesus had said to her, "You worship what you do not know. We," meaning the Jews, "we worship what we know," because salvation originates with the Jews. Jesus, of course, was a Jew. He was circumcised on the 8th day. He, in fact, on his way through Samaria up to Galilee, he had just left Jerusalem where he had been attending the festival. And he always attended the annual festivals as a male. That was a requirement of the law that every Jewish male must observe. But Jesus was indicating that the formal worship that had been instituted by Moses was going to be replaced, a new form of worship. And of course, we know now that Jesus is the head or the center of that new form of worship that involves spirit and truth, not formalism and ritual. Well, Jesus told his apostles that they would know the truth, and the truth would set them free. But did they know the truth, all of the truth? No. It was a very gradual process. And did they have the Spirit, all of the Spirit? Again, it was a gradual process of enlightenment. To underscore their unenlightenment, on many occasions, Jesus told them that the Son of Man was going to be betrayed, that he would be put to death, that he would be brought back to life. And the apostles could not comprehend that vital Christian truth, something that is elementary to us today. In fact, on one occasion, Peter tried to reprove Jesus. When Jesus said the Son of Man was going to be put to death, he said, "Lord, Lord, be kind to yourself. You won't have that destiny at all." You see, the Jews who were expecting the Messiah, they understood a little bit about what the Messiah was going to do. He was going to become a king, but they assumed he was going to become a king within that Jewish system of things. And they assumed, since they were under the yoke of the Roman Empire, that Jesus, as the Messiah, would become king at some point in the near future, sit down on the throne of David in Jerusalem, and throw off the Roman yoke. And so it just didn't compute with Peter and the other apostles that Jesus was going to be put to death. No, you're the Messiah. You're here, and let's get on with it. but they didn't understand the whole picture. They certainly didn't understand the prophecies. And it wasn't until Jesus was actually resurrected and he materialized and appeared to them in different guises over numerous occasions over the 40 days before his ascension back to heaven, he opened their minds, didn't he? And finally they grasped what the prophets had actually foretold, that the Messiah would be put to death but be brought back to life. And one of the last things Jesus said to them after his resurrection, that he would be with them all the days until the conclusion. And he was returning during that conclusion. So that would be when he would become king over not just Israel, but the world. And it's interesting, too, the apostles and other disciples had been given God's Spirit, a measure, and they were empowered to perform many miracles. Jesus sent them out by twos, and they came back reporting that the demons had been made subject to them. They performed healings and all the things that Jesus did. And yet they still were in that unenlightened state about Jesus' death and resurrection. But Jesus, entrusted them with the message that go and proclaim the kingdom of the heavens has drawn near. So they were able to accomplish that. But then after Jesus was resurrected and appeared to them, on one occasion, he blew upon them and said, "Receive Holy Spirit." Now, they had Holy Spirit before because they performed miracles. But Jesus gave them more and opened up their minds. And yet at that point, this was before Jesus' ascension and before he poured out the Spirit on Pentecost, at that point they were not even anointed by the Spirit. But then eventually they were. And a transformation took place, didn't it? You just look at the life of Peter. He was, the most outspoken one and always, saying the wrong thing at times. But he assured Jesus that, if all the others leave you, I will die for you. And Jesus says, "Oh, will you now? Before a cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. And of course that happened on the night Jesus was arrested. But then, just some 2 months later, Peter became the spokesman, really, for the Christian congregation. On the day of Pentecost, he stood up and explained to the crowd what this tongue-speaking phenomenon was. And then when the chief priests and Pharisees demanded that they stop preaching, he boldly told them, "Look, we must obey God as ruler rather than men." And he charged them with putting the Son of God to death. So he had become fearless, transformed by the progression of God's Spirit upon him. Well, what happened to the truth? And I might point out as well that even at that, the apostles still, of course, could not understand the things having to do with the second coming. Even John with his revelation, he was given this marvelous vision of transported into the day of the Lord. But there's no way he could understand what all of that meant or how it would unfold. So, worshiping in spirit and truth, it was not fully realized in the first century. And of course, the truth gradually faded out. We know that, and the apostles foretold, Jesus foretold that wicked men would come in not treat the flock with tenderness. And eventually this grand apostasy ensued, and the Roman Empire, which had been the persecutor of Christians, threw them in the arenas with wild animals, and apparently some crazy emperors used Christians for torches. They tied them to poles and doused them in oil and used them to light the streets at night. But after a couple of hundred years, Satan switched tactics and stopped the frontal attack and became the benefactor of Christians, supposedly. And even though only a small percentage of the people within the realm of the Roman Empire actually even called themselves Christians, Christianity, as it existed then, became the official religion of the Roman Empire. And of course they brought in all the pagan rituals and beliefs of the Jew, of the Romans. And that was the beginning of Christendom, and the truth was just overshadowed and swallowed up. But when Jesus talked about the conclusion of the system of things, he assured us that there would be those who were his disciples, who would be active, serving him. And so they would have to know something about the truth. So there would have to be a reformation. And I believe that is what has happened over the last 140 years with the Watchtower organization, originally the Bible students and now Jehovah's Witnesses, so that an identifiable group of anointed Christians have come on the scene. But do we really know the whole truth? Well, it's similar to the situation in the first century. And Jehovah's Witnesses don't appreciate this yet, but there is yet to be an outpouring of Spirit and a full revelation of truth, the whole truth. Isn't that what the second coming of Jesus is all about? When Jesus was talking to the Samaritan woman, and she said, well, we know Messiah is coming, and when he comes, he'll explain all things to us. And of course, Jesus said, he that is speaking to you, I who am speaking to you am he. But again, Jesus didn't really explain all things to his disciples back then, did he? No. In fact, he told them he was going to send a helper, and it would guide them into all the truth. The helper being the Spirit, of course. Well, we find that obviously God gives his Spirit to those who obey him, but he only gives as much as we need at the time to accomplish his work, whatever that is. Like I say, the disciples had a measure of his Spirit. They performed miracles and so forth. Jehovah's Witnesses, some are anointed. That calls them, opens up their mind to God's calling, his invitation. He gives us his Spirit to empower us to teach and preach and so forth. But I would like to call your attention to some relevant prophecies in the Hebrew text, of course. When it comes to the second coming of Jesus, it's rather strange that Jehovah's Witnesses do not really use that expression, and it really doesn't have any resonance with them. In fact, the Watchtower claims that the second coming of Christ has already occurred. It's done and over with. He's here. He came in 1914. That is the second coming. But yet the scriptures point to the fact that the second coming of Christ ends Christianity. It's the consummation of all things. It's not the beginning of another long period that spans generations. Anyway, the book of Isaiah has a lot to say about the coming of Christ, both his first coming and his second. And it's interesting, the name Isaiah, it means the salvation of Jehovah. And do you know what the name Jesus means? Jehovah is salvation. Just switch it around. So that's an interesting connection, isn't it? Because like I say, Isaiah is all about the coming of Christ. Only in Isaiah it refers to the coming of Jehovah. Well, a Trinitarian might say, well, yeah, that's because Jesus is Jehovah. They're one and the same. They just change their name around. That's not how it works. Jesus comes in the name of his Father. He rules on behalf of Jehovah. He's not Jehovah. Jehovah empowers him, gives him authority. Anyway, the 30th chapter of Isaiah, it's interesting, the Watchtower, it pulls scriptures out of context, really. It's really what Trinitarians do or anybody else that tries to prove a point. But the 30th chapter of Isaiah, the 18th or 19th verse, 20th verse, the Watchtower quotes quite frequently. In verse 20, it says, your grand instructor will no longer hide himself, and you will see your grand instructor with your own eyes. And then verse 21, and your own ears will hear a word behind you saying, this is the way, walk in it, in case you should go to the right or in case you should go to the left. Well, if you go up a few verses, he's talking about this hard discipline that he's going to bring upon his people. But then he assures them that Jehovah is waiting patiently to show you favor. And he will rise up to show you mercy, for Jehovah is a God of justice. Okay? So, let's go back to that verse in the 20th verse. Though Jehovah will give you bread in the form of distress and water in the form of oppression, your grand instructor will no longer hide himself. Is Jehovah hiding? The Watchtower claims that when we hear a word behind us saying, this is the way, that's actually the Bible. That when we read a Bible verse, it can help us to change and redirect our course. But that's not what this is talking about. This is talking about the second coming of Christ, the revelation of Christ. Do you know, the revelation of Jesus and the manifestation of Jesus and the parousia of Jesus are all three interchangeable terms? And that the Watchtower doesn't teach it that way, does it? Jehovah's Witnesses believe that the parousia has begun, but it's invisible. But yet, manifestation, if something is manifest, and the Greek word that's translated as manifest is epiphania. It's where our English word epiphany comes from. And in Greek, it literally means a shining appearance. And of course, revelation is something that is revealed. So how can you have an invisible manifestation? I mean, it's absurd. An invisible revelation. There's no such thing as an invisible parousia. Jesus, well, I won't go into it on this this video, but I hope to talk about it more at length, and I have done one video on the parousia. But anyway, so your Grand Instructor will no longer hide himself. And with your own eyes, you will see your Grand Instructor. No man may see God and yet live, right? Moses asked to see God, and God said, you can't do it. So he had Moses turn his back, and he put his hand, and he walked behind him and showed him a glimpse of his glory. And Moses came down from the mountain. His face was glowing. And the Hebrews were terrified. They couldn't even look at him. He had to put a veil over his face. He was freaking everybody out. And that was a glimpse of God's glory. So we're not literally going to see our Grand Instructor. But Jesus is also called, in Isaiah, the Wonderful Counselor. And when he returns, he is going to be this Grand Instructor. He was Jehovah's instructor before, wasn't he? When he was on the earth in the first century, he said, what I teach is not mine. I only teach what the Father has told me, what I've seen him doing. That's what I'm relating. So Jehovah being the Grand Instructor and him no longer hiding himself has to do with the revelation of Jesus. The epiphany, the epiphania of Jesus, epiphania. That is when your ears will hear a word behind you saying, this is the way, walk in it. So up to this point, Jehovah's Witnesses are like the apostles who think that the kingdom is here now. It was set up in 1914. Let's go. There's the new system. They're as blind as was Peter, trying to reprove Jesus. You won't have that destiny at all. So this will be quite an astounding thing. The revelation of Jesus Christ at his second coming. And let's see. Verse 25 and 26, it says, and on every tall mountain and every high hill will be streams and water courses. Well, what was Jesus talking about with the Samaritan woman, about this water of life bubbling up to impart everlasting life? Well, streams and water courses, the full provision from God through Christ for life, the truth, and the Spirit. And the light of the full moon will become like the light of the sun, and the light of the sun will become 7 times stronger, like the light of 7 days, in the day that Jehovah binds up the breakdown of his people and heals the severe wound from the blow he inflicted. Has Jehovah inflicted a severe blow upon Jehovah's Witnesses? If so, when? 1918, when Brother Rutherford went to prison? I don't think so. And has the light become 7 times brighter since then? Again, no. The severe blow is during the return of Christ. So up to this point, the Watchtower has assured Jehovah's Witnesses that everything has been fulfilled except a few things. The Great Tribulation, the fall of Babylon, and the Watchtower has assured Jehovah's Witnesses there cannot be another world war. There cannot be another sign of Christ that will be fulfilled more convincingly than what happened in 1914 and 1918 with the Spanish influenza. That can't happen again. All those things are like a fingerprint. There is only one. I don't know. So it will be a severe humiliation, and quite a blow to the Watchtower organization to have these things unfold. So they're the experts. They're the prophets. They know everything about the truth. No. They know some truth. They've been given a certain amount of God's Spirit, not the full measure. That's coming after the discipline, after the severe wounding. Turning over to the 32nd chapter. Here again, it opens, "Look, a king will reign for righteousness, and princes will rule for justice." Of course, that's Jesus Christ. That's what the book of Isaiah is about. The coming of the king. The princes will rule for justice. The Watchtower says they're elders. That's a hard one. It goes on to say they will be like a hiding place from the wind and a place of concealment from the rainstorm. Well, according to the 28th and 29th chapters of Isaiah, the rainstorm hasn't begun yet. The severe storm is coming. The storm of Jehovah's anger. It will wash away the place of concealment. And those who have concealed themselves from falsehood will be flooded out. 1914. The Watchtower claims that God has given them a blank check since 1914. His unqualified approval. And so, again, notice in verse 3 this eye-opening event. Then the eyes of those seeing will no longer be pasted shut. It's an eye-opening thing, like when Jesus was resurrected and he appeared to his apostles. Even up to that point, it says some were doubting. But he opened their eyes and ears. Go on down to 14 and 15, because this is the pattern. First comes a desolation, which will serve as discipline and chastisement. Then the full blessing and spirit. For the fortified tower has been forsaken. The noisy city has been abandoned. It's talking about God's city, his earthly organization. Ophel and the Watchtower have become a permanent wasteland, a delight for wild donkeys, a pasture for the flocks. Until, verse 15, until the Spirit is poured out on us from above, and the wilderness becomes an orchard, and the orchard is regarded as a forest. So again, until the Spirit is poured out on us. The second chapter of Joel talks about that as well, doesn't it? And this time of great catastrophe, Jehovah intervenes in behalf of his people and drives the northerner far away, it says in the second chapter of Joel. And then he says, in those days I shall pour out my Spirit upon my sons and daughters and maidservants and menservants. So that is the full outpouring of Spirit upon both anointed and those who have an earthly hope of surviving the end of this world. So that's my mission, you might say, is to raise awareness of this impending second coming of Jesus and what it entails. I would like to mention that I've written a book some years ago. The first edition of Jehovah Himself Has Become King was published in 2005. I updated it in 2010 and did a third edition in 2016 called the Final Edition. So, at any rate, the second edition and the third edition are available for free. The second edition is online, and it also has audio. I've read all the chapters. That's at Jehovah is King. spaced by hyphens, Jehovah hyphen is hyphen king. I'll put the link here, and then the third edition is available on Amazon as a paperback only. They didn't have it as a hard copy, but I've tried to make it as affordable as possible. It's a rather large book, but it's $17. If you want a hard, soft copy, you can purchase it from Amazon, or the PDF is available on the website Jehovah is King. So that's about it. Thank you for watching, and speak to you again.